The boarding happened in motion. An Iranian vessel was pushing toward the Gulf of Oman when a U.S. warship moved in, seized it, and turned one piece of contested water into the center of the global system for the rest of the day. The market understood before the politicians did. Crude jumped, stocks rolled over, and the ceasefire everyone had been pretending was still alive suddenly looked like what it probably was all along. A pause being priced as theater. That is where the story really starts. Not with the ship by itself, not with another headline about Hormuz, not even with the military exchange that followed. The real story is that Iran is trying to force the world to confront a hierarchy Washington has spent decades teaching the world not to notice. A paper empire still lives or dies by physical chokepoints. That is the warning. And that is why this moment is much more dangerous than it looks. Most people are still reading this as a naval escalation story. A blockade, a seizure, a retaliatory drone strike, maybe more pressure, maybe more sanctions, maybe another cycle of military signaling. Fine. Great powers know how to talk inside that vocabulary. They can live there for months. Iran is trying to move the war out of that vocabulary. It is saying, you think the system rests on paper confidence? We are going to remind you that the paper still depends on the barrel. That is a very different war. I want to give you one framework for understanding it. Paper collateral versus physical collateral. Treasuries are paper collateral. The dollar is paper collateral. Reserve status is paper collateral. Safe haven demand is paper collateral. These are claims on future stability. They are valuable because the world believes the system underneath them will remain orderly enough to honor them. Oil is physical collateral. Hormuz is physical collateral. Bab el Mandeb is physical collateral. Refining capacity is physical collateral. Jet fuel is physical collateral. Transit time is physical collateral. Insurance risk is physical collateral. The modern American system is built on the assumption that paper collateral sits higher in the hierarchy. Most of the time it does. That is because normality protects it. As long as ships move, as long as crude flows, as long as inflation is not out of control. As long as central banks still have room, paper can keep pricing the future. Chokepoint wars reverse the order. When real roots shake, the physical starts repricing the paper. That is what the seizure revealed. The market did not care mainly about the cargo on one ship. It cared about what the seizure meant for every future barrel trying to move through the same corridor. Once enforcement tightens in Hormuz, every barrel carries more delay risk, more insurance risk, more political risk, more inflation risk. That is why crude moved first. And once crude moves first, everything else begins to move behind it. That chain is the whole story. Higher oil keeps inflation alive. Sticky inflation keeps rates high. High rates make refinancing harder. Harder refinancing makes treasury management uglier. Ugly treasury management weakens confidence in the paper collateral at the center of the American system. That is the chain Iran is trying to weaponize. This is why the IMF warning matters more than most headlines do. People hear that the safe haven premium on U.S. Treasuries is thinning, and they treat it as technical commentary. It is not technical commentary. It is the center of the problem. America can survive a lot of things. What it cannot survive comfortably is an oil shock colliding with inflation pressure at the exact moment its debt machine most needs calm rates, easy refinancing, and unquestioned faith. That is the nightmare structure, and it gets worse if Treasury issuance has already leaned too hard into the short end because the entire system is then making one giant hidden bet. It is betting that short rates will come down. It is betting that inflation will cool soon enough. It is betting that the physical world will calm down before the paper world has to refinance itself at a much uglier price. Iran sees that bet. That is what makes its warning more sophisticated than people realize. Iran is not saying we can outgun the United States. Iran is saying we can force the United States to defend a paper empire against physical vulnerabilities. That is much harder. And it is not just talking, it is pointing at real stress points. Europe's fuel problem is one of them. Most people hear that Europe could be facing severe jet fuel strain within weeks and file it away as some narrow aviation problem. It is not. It is a signal that the product chain is more fragile than the financial commentary wants to admit. Once aviation starts straining, tourism strains. Once freight strains, goods prices strain. Once logistics strains, whole sectors begin importing inflation they did not create. That is how a regional choke point becomes a global price regime. This is also why Bab el-Mandeb matters so much. Hormuz is already enough to shake the system. But once the Red Sea enters the same strategic equation, the whole crisis stops being about one corridor and becomes about compression. Fewer viable routes, fewer comfortable workarounds, more dependence on every pipeline, every receiving terminal, every pumping station, every insurance decision, every refinery schedule. That is where oil stops being a commodity story and becomes an architecture story. And once it becomes an architecture story, Washington is trapped. Because Washington now has 3 roads, and every road is bad. Road 1 is to tighten the blockade harder. That sounds like strength. In practice, it raises exactly the pressure that makes the inflation and Treasury story worse. More enforcement means more fear in the corridor. More fear in the corridor means higher energy prices and uglier funding math back home. Road 2 is to quietly ease off. That sounds like prudence. In practice, it proves that Iran found the right lever. It tells the region that a state sitting next to a real choke point can force the United States to soften a position not by defeating it militarily, but by threatening the physical basis underneath its paper credibility. Road 3 is to widen the war and fold China more explicitly into the logic. And this may be the most reckless road of all, because more and more people in Washington are now saying openly what used to remain half. Hidden, maybe Iran is not the final target. Maybe the deeper point is China. Cut China off from Iranian oil, disrupt Chinese trade in the Gulf, raise China's energy costs, turn Middle Eastern pressure into a China strategy. On the surface, that logic is seductive. In reality, it may be strategic self-harm because Washington keeps making the same mistake. It keeps imagining China as if it were strategically isolated. China is not isolated. Every serious effort to squeeze Beijing's energy position creates stronger incentives for Russia and China to integrate faster, not slower. Every effort to disrupt Chinese access to Gulf energy raises the value of Russian substitution. Every extra shock teaches Eurasian powers the same lesson. Root around the American system while you still can. That is how a pressure campaign mutates into a consolidation engine for your adversaries. Washington thinks it is raising the price for Beijing. It may actually be accelerating a tighter Eurasian bloc. And if that happens, then the war produces 2 outcomes at once. In the short run, America absorbs inflation stress, debt stress, and market stress. In the medium run, America accelerates de-dollarization habits, alternative settlement behavior, and a wider international appetite for reducing dependence on U.S. controlled financial plumbing. That is how empires accidentally educate the world against themselves, not by disappearing, by weaponizing their advantages so aggressively that everyone else starts building exits. This is why I do not dismiss Iran's warning as just propaganda. Yes, it is propaganda. But it is propaganda anchored to a real structural vulnerability. America's supremacy still depends on a world where physical flows remain stable enough to justify trust in paper. Chokepoint wars attack that relationship directly. They push oil higher. They keep inflation alive. They make rates harder. They complicate debt management. They weaken safe haven psychology. And they remind the world of a very old truth. A paper empire still rests on a physical world. Once that truth becomes visible, the real question is no longer whether America can seize another ship. Of course it can. The real question is whether it can keep the physical system calm enough to preserve the credibility of the paper collateral at the center of its empire. That is harder. That is the deeper fight. Now, not who controls one vessel, who gets to price reality. That is the real war inside this war. And when you look at it that way, the likely ending becomes clearer. I do not think Washington can live for very long with simultaneous pressure on oil inflation rates and debt rollover. I think Dick will beat rhetoric. It always does eventually. Great powers posture toward pride until the last possible moment. Then they retreat toward stability and invent a story about why retreat was always strategic. That is the pattern I see here. Not because Washington is wise, because the physical system does not care about how powerful the speechwriters sound. Oil is real, inflation is real, debt rollover is real, treasury demand is real. If the war keeps pressing on all four at once, the U.S. system eventually has to choose between strategic pride and financial stability, and it will choose stability late, reluctantly, and under a mountain of new rhetoric. That is why this warning is fatal, not because America collapses tomorrow, because the logic is cumulative. Every extra week of war raises the cost. Every extra spike in oil raises inflation pressure. Every extra inflation scare raises rate pressure. Every extra rates problem raises debt pressure. Every extra debt problem raises faith pressure. Strong systems are rarely broken by one dramatic strike. They are weakened by repeated moments when reality forces the paper to reprice itself. That is what Iran is trying to do. Now, not defeat America head on Force America to defend the paper collateral of its empire against the physical choke points of the world it still depends on. And once the world understands that is the real fight, it begins to understand something even bigger. The ship was never the whole story. The ship was the translation. The seizure was the moment physical leverage announced itself to the paper system. And the market, for one brief second, believed the translation immediately. When the bond meets the barrel gets to speak first.